At 2:17 a.m., the radio came alive on a frequency no one had used in over a decade. The voice knew the call sign. It knew the coordinates. And then it said his name. These aren't campfire stories. They're the kind of things soldiers don't talk about, because some orders never expire. I never planned on re-enlisting. Not after my first contract chewed me up the way it did. But life in Killeen, Texas, has a way of boxing you into choices you don't feel proud of. And Fort Hood was the only place that ever made sense to me, even when it didn't. My father served here in the early 92nds, and when he died, his old stories were all I had left of him, stories about endless night watches, the smell of oil and dust, and how the base never really slept. I told myself re-enlisting wasn't about him. But the truth is, I wanted to stand where he stood, wear the same patch, feel like some part of him was still close. That's how I ended up assigned to a support unit tasked with base security rotations. The kind of quiet work no one brags about. It was routine, predictable, and safe, or so I thought. The first time I saw him was during a night shift change, just after midnight, when the air was thick with heat and the hum of insects never fully stopped. He stood at the edge of the floodlights, helmet on, rifle slung correctly, posture perfect. He nodded at me like we'd met before. I remember thinking he looked tired in a way only soldiers do. Eyes sunken but alert, like sleep was something he'd forgotten how to trust. He said his name was Miller. Just Miller. No rank spoken, but I assumed specialist, or maybe corporal. He knew my name before I introduced myself. That should have bothered me more than it did. Over the next week, Miller was always there on night watch, rotating posts with us, filling in when someone called out, never complaining. He followed protocol to the letter, too perfectly, actually. He never joked, never checked his phone, never bent the rules like everyone else did to stay sane. When we walked the perimeter, I could hear his boots in sync with mine, the gravel crunching at the same rhythm. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, I caught a faint metallic smell, like old pennies and gun oil. Stronger when he was close. He talked just enough to seem normal, asking about my hometown, my plans after the army, whether my dad ever mentioned the training grounds on the north side of the base. When I asked how he knew about my father, he just said, "People talk," and changed the subject. The first real warning came during a routine roster check before a long overnight detail. I was scanning the printed list when I realized Miller's name wasn't there. I figured it was a clerical mistake. Fort Hood paperwork is legendary for being a mess. Still, I mentioned it to my squad leader, who frowned and flipped through his own copy. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't say anything at all at first. He just stared at the page longer than necessary, then said, "He must be attached from another unit." Except when I asked which one, no one seemed to know. The platoon sergeant said he'd look into it. Miller showed up anyway, standing where he always did, eyes reflecting the floodlights. When I asked him directly what unit he was with, he smiled, just barely, and said, "This one," like it was a joke we both understood. As the nights passed, strange things started happening. Radios crackled when Miller keyed his mic, a low static buzz that made my teeth itch. The thermal cameras along the fence line glitched whenever he walked past, blooming white for a second before snapping back to normal. Once, during a vehicle patrol, I glanced in the rearview mirror and didn't see him in the back seat. Even though I could hear his breathing right behind me, I didn't say anything. None of us did. There's an unspoken rule in the military about not being the guy who sees things. Especially on a base with a reputation like Fort Hood's, people already talk enough about the place, about disappearances and accidents that never quite add up. One night, around 2:30 a.m., Miller and I were posted near an old storage facility, slated for demolition. The building was dark, windows boarded up, the concrete stained with decades of leaks and rust. Miller stopped walking suddenly. I nearly ran into him. He tilted his head, listening. I asked what he heard, but he didn't answer. Then, very quietly, I heard it too, a distant cadence call, muffled, like a formation marching far away. Boots striking in perfect time. There shouldn't have been anyone training out there at that hour. I radioed it in. The response came back flat and immediate. Negative activity in that sector. When I looked back at Miller, his face had gone pale under the lights, and for a split second, I thought I saw something old and hollow in his eyes, like he was remembering something he couldn't escape. "They're late," he said, more to himself than to me. After that night, my sleep fell apart. I dreamed of roll calls that never ended, names echoing across empty fields, my own voice hoarse from answering again and again. Every time I woke up, my room smelled faintly of oil and dust. The platoon sergeant pulled me aside a few days later and told me Miller didn't exist, not officially. No records, no transfer orders, nothing. He asked me if I was feeling okay, if I'd been under a lot of stress. I lied and said I was fine. I didn't tell him Miller had been standing behind him the whole time, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating off his uniform. The night it all came apart was during a full accountability check after a minor security incident. We were lined up under the lights, names being called. When they got to Miller, there was a pause. The officer frowned, checked his tablet, and skipped to the next name. Miller didn't respond. He just stood there, eyes forward. No one else seemed to notice. I felt my chest tighten. After formation, I confronted him. I demanded to know who he was. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "I was assigned here," he said. "Just not anymore." He told me about a training exercise years ago, before my enlistment, when his unit was sent out to the North Grounds. There was a miscommunication, a live fire range that wasn't properly cleared. Shots fired where they shouldn't have been. Men went down. Paperwork got messy. The army moved on. "We never got dismissed," he said. "No one told us to stand down." His voice wavered for the first time. "So we stayed." As he spoke, the air grew colder, the night sounds fading, until it felt like the base itself was holding its breath. I realized then that Miller wasn't just one soldier. He was all of them. Every name that never got answered, every body that never got counted right. He was the space left behind when a roster is wrong. The floodlights flickered. For a moment, I saw more figures standing behind him, outlines only. Helmets and rifles, and empty faces stretching back into the dark. Miller stepped closer. "You see us," he said. It wasn't a question. "That means you're on watch now." I don't remember leaving my post. I don't remember how I got back to my barracks room. The next morning, I was written up for abandoning my position. No one mentioned Miller. His name never came up again. I finished my contract early and got out. I left Killeen. I tried to build a normal life. But some nights, when the world is quiet and my phone has no signal, I hear a radio crackle that isn't there, and a voice calling names I don't recognize. Waiting for an answer. I still smell oil and dust sometimes, and every now and then, when I pass a place where people are supposed to be safe, I feel that same cold presence at my shoulder, patient and disciplined, still standing watch, still waiting for someone to finally tell him he can go home. I didn't think about Fort Hood much after I left Texas. That was the point of leaving. I moved north, found a warehouse job, kept my head down, learned how to sleep without listening for radios or footsteps. For a while, it worked. Then one night, almost a year later, my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. The number was blocked. I let it go to voicemail. I always let it go to voicemail. The message was nothing but static at first, the kind that sounds like breathing if you listen too long. Then, under it, I heard boots on gravel. Not loud, disciplined. A pause followed. The exact length of time it takes for someone to check a list. A voice came through calm, familiar, strained in a way that made my stomach drop. Miller, it said, like a name being called during roll. Then my own. I deleted the message. I told myself it was a prank, or stress, or some leftover reflex. My brain hadn't shaken loose yet. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the Department of Defense. No return address. Inside was a single page, confirming receipt of my final out-processing paperwork. At the bottom, beneath my signature, was a line I didn't remember filling out. Assigned duty status, night watch. The ink looked old, pressed deep into the paper. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the room filled with the faint smell of oil and dust. Somewhere outside, a radio cracked once, then went silent. I understood then that I hadn't been followed. I had been logged, and whatever stands watch at Fort Hood doesn't stay in one place, it just waits for the next name to answer. I volunteered for night watch because it was easier than sitting alone in the barracks, listening to my thoughts circle the same regrets, and because Fort Bragg, what they were already starting to call Fort Liberty, had a way of swallowing daylight and making the dark feel earned, like a test you could pass if you stayed alert. I'd grown up just outside Fayetteville, watched helicopters skim the tree line my whole life, and enlisting felt less like a choice than gravity. My mother worked 2 jobs, my father disappeared early, and the Army offered structure, money, and a promise that if I did what I was told, the noise in my head might finally quiet down. By the time I was assigned to perimeter duty near one of the older training grounds on the north side of the base, I'd learned that quiet isn't the same as peace. The first night was humid and still, cicadas screaming like they were trying to keep something else from being heard, and the floodlights carved harsh islands out of the darkness while the woods pressed close, patient and black. The training area itself had been officially inactive for years. Obsolete courses, rusting obstacles, a kill house no one bothered to knock down. But we still rotated guards because someone high up believed unused spaces were where trouble liked to breed. My radio felt heavier than usual on my vest, and I remember thinking that the darkness out there didn't feel empty so much as organized, like it had lanes and boundaries the way we did. Around 1:40 a.m., I heard the first cadence, faint and distant, boots hitting dirt in perfect time, a low call and response drifting through the trees. Training units weren't scheduled anywhere near us, and the sound shouldn't have carried that far anyway, but it was unmistakable. The rhythm drilled into anyone who'd ever marched. I radioed it in, expecting a board confirmation or a joke at my expense. But the response came back, clipped and immediate. Negative activity, maintain post. I told myself it was imagination, wind, maybe an echo from another range, and went back to scanning the tree line, counting breaths, grounding myself the way my father used to say soldiers did when fear crept in. The cadence stopped abruptly, like someone had cut a tape, and the silence afterward felt louder than the sound had been. The second night, the radio crackled whenever I turned toward the woods. A dry hiss that faded when I looked away, and the smell hit me, then damp earth mixed with something metallic. Old sweat and gun oil, a scent that belonged more to memory than the present. I told myself Fort Bragg was old, soaked with decades of training, and places like that held on to things. The way gym bags never quite lost the smell of effort. Around 2:17 a.m., my thermal viewer flared white in a tight cluster near the old obstacle course, then snapped back to black, and when I blinked, I thought I saw movement figures threading between the trees with the confidence of people who knew the ground by heart. I reported it. Again, the answer came back. Negative. Hold position. The third night, I wasn't alone. Specialist Carter drew the short straw with me, and having another set of eyes should have made things easier. But it only made the wrongness clearer. Carter was from Ohio, talked too much when he was nervous. And when the cadence rolled in again, closer this time, he stopped mid-sentence and stared into the dark like he was listening for his name. We stood there under the floodlights, rifles steady, and the call sounded different, up close, not shouted, not strained, but disciplined, like it had been practiced until it lost all emotion. Carter keyed his mic and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I didn't answer because something else had joined the sound. The faint clink of metal, gear shifting, the collective breath of people moving together. The radio answered us both with static, and then, underneath it, a voice that didn't belong on our channel murmured a grid coordinate I recognized from old maps, a section of the grounds that had been closed after an accident years back. The cadence stopped again, and when Carter laughed it off too loudly, I knew he was lying to himself. Over the next week, the nights blurred together, each one adding a new detail that refused to be dismissed. Footprints appeared in the sandy soil at dawn, dozens of them, then vanished by the next rotation, smoothed away as if they'd never been there. The floodlights flickered when the cadence started, always at the same time, always from the same direction. And the woods seemed to pull inward, branches knitting a little tighter. I started dreaming of standing at attention while names echoed through the trees, waking with my jaw clenched and my uniform damp with sweat. I asked around about the training grounds, and the answers came reluctantly, pieced together from half-remembered briefings and rumors no one liked to own. A night exercise years ago, a miscommunication between units, live rounds where blanks were expected, medevac delayed by weather and confusion. The official story ended there. The unofficial one didn't. It said the area was cursed, haunted, off limits for a reason, and that if you heard cadence at night, you were supposed to ignore it. The night it finally broke through my defenses was the night Carter didn't show up. I took post alone, telling myself he was sick or reassigned. But when the cadence began, it wasn't distant anymore. It was right there, boots thudding on packed earth beyond the floodlights, the call sharp enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. My radio came alive without me touching it. The same coordinates whispered again, followed by a pause that felt deliberate. Against my better judgment, I answered, The static cleared just enough for a voice to say my last name, careful and exact, like it had been waiting for me to speak. I don't remember deciding to move. Only the sensation of stepping beyond the edge of the light and into the woods. The smell growing stronger. The darkness rearranging itself to make room. The figures were there then. Not solid so much as suggested. Helmets catching what little light filtered through the branches. Faces turned forward in concentration. They didn't look at me. They didn't need to. I knew, in a way that bypassed logic, that they were running the same lane over and over. Never dismissed, never corrected, repeating the last order that made sense. One of them fell out of formation near the old obstacle course, and the line adjusted without breaking stride, the cadence never faltering. I wanted to call out, to tell them the exercise was over, that it had been over for years. But the words stuck in my throat. When the cadence finally stopped, the woods exhaled, and I found myself back under the floodlights, radio silent, heart hammering like I'd sprinted miles. The incident report I filed was short and careful. It said nothing about voices or figures, only equipment interference and possible wildlife movement. Carter transferred units the next day without saying goodbye. A week later, the North Training Grounds were officially decommissioned, fenced off with fresh signs warning of unexploded ordnance. I finished my rotation and counted the days until reassignment, telling myself I'd imagined it all, that stress and darkness could build convincing lies. Years have passed since then. I left the Army, moved away from Fayetteville, learned how to fill my nights with noise and light. But sometimes, when the world goes quiet, I catch myself listening for a rhythm I can't unlearn, and at 2:17 a.m., my phone will buzz with no notification. My room will smell faintly of damp earth and oil, and I'll feel the pull of an unfinished watch, a lane that still needs to be run, waiting for someone who knows the ground to step out of the light and take his place. I took the night shift at the radio relay station outside Tonopah, Nevada, because I needed something quiet enough to let my life settle back into shape, or at least stop shaking long enough that I could pretend it had. The town sits in a bowl of desert and sky, the kind of place where signals travel farther than people do. And after my brother Evan disappeared during a training exercise years earlier, radios were the only things that still made sense to me. Evan had been Air Force, communications, stationed not far from Nellis, and when his unit was reassigned and one exercise was quietly erased from public schedules, all that came back to our family were condolences and a box of effects that smelled faintly of dust and metal. I learned early that unanswered questions don't fade. They change frequency. That's how I ended up alone most nights, monitoring legacy bands no one officially used anymore, logging static and weather bursts, while the desert cooled and the stars came out sharp and cold. The first time the transmission came through, it was easy to dismiss. A brief carrier wave rose out of the noise at 2:17 a.m., pulsed twice, then dropped. Old equipment hiccups all the time, especially when the temperature swings. I logged it and moved on. The second night, it happened again, longer this time. A clipped tone, followed by a fragment of voice, buried under static. I leaned closer to the speaker, the hum vibrating in my jaw, and felt that old prickle of attention I used to get as a kid when Evan tuned his ham radio and told me to listen for patterns. The fragment ended too cleanly, like someone had let go of a push-to-talk switch. I flagged it. On the third night, the voice came back, clear enough to understand one word, spoken carefully, like it mattered. Relay. The hair on my arms lifted. That was the call sign for a temporary station used during exercises in the late 2000s. A designation I knew because Evan had explained it once, proud of how quickly his unit could spin a network out of nothing. I told myself it was coincidence, some distant hobbyist echoing old jargon. But when I checked the frequency allocation history, the band had been dead for over a decade. The desert has a way of making time feel thin. And as the nights stacked up, the transmission grew bolder, lasting longer, threading through the static with a confidence that made my stomach knot. At 2:17 a.m. every night, like a metronome, the signal rose, stabilized, and delivered something new. Coordinates spoken in a flat, professional cadence, followed by a pause that felt expectant. The coordinates pointed to a grid square inside the Tonopah test range, an area that had been restricted, reclassified, and renamed so many times that maps disagreed with themselves. I reported it up the chain. The response came back polite and uninterested. Atmospheric anomaly, equipment drift, log, and continue. I did, because that's what you do when you want to keep a job that keeps you from thinking too hard. But I started recording everything on a personal drive, labeling files with dates and times. Because the voicemail, calm, strained in a way I couldn't quite place, sounded like it was holding something together with effort. On the 7th night, the voice said my name. Not shouted, not startled, but precise. Like a checklist item, I froze with my hand hovering over the console. Heart banging against my ribs hard enough to make the meters jitter. I hadn't identified myself on air. I hadn't spoken at all. The transmission continued anyway, the same coordinates, the same pause, and then another word, softer, confirm. The room smelled suddenly of warm electronics and dust, and beneath it, something older, like sun-baked canvas and oil. I didn't answer. I couldn't. When the signal dropped, the silence pressed in so hard my ears rang. I drove home at dawn with the windows down, trying to outrun the sense that I'd been seen through a one-way mirror. The next day, I pulled Evan's old notebooks from a box I'd sworn I was done opening. He'd kept meticulous notes, frequencies, sketches of makeshift antennae, reminders to hydrate, jokes written sideways in the margins. Near the back, I found a page marked with a star. A grid coordinate was written there, circled twice, with a note underneath. Relay up, no dismissal yet. My hands shook as I compared it to the recordings. It matched. That night, when the transmission came back, it carried a new texture, like multiple signals overlapping imperfectly. The voice repeated the coordinates, then added a timestamp that made no sense years out of date, and a line that felt rehearsed. Standing by. Against every instinct, I keyed the mic and answered with the only thing that felt safe. Receiving, I said. The static thinned, and for a moment the voice sounded relieved. We've been holding, it replied. The desert outside my window seemed to lean closer, the horizon flattening, the stars dimming like someone had turned a dial. I asked who we was. The answer came back delayed, distorted, as if the word had to push through resistance. Team. I asked what they needed. The pause stretched. Then, acknowledgement. Over the next weeks, the transmissions filled in around me. Not all at once, but in fragments that hooked into my days and wouldn't let go. They spoke of reroutes and weather holds, of an exercise extended by minutes that turned into hours, of an extraction that never arrived because a different call sign had been cleared to use the airspace. They never said anyone died. They never said anyone lived. They talked like professionals who trusted the process and assumed the mistake would be corrected any moment now. Each night at 2:17, they checked in. Each night, I answered, because not answering felt like erasing them all over again. My supervisors noticed my logs getting thicker, my eyes darker. They asked if I needed time off. I said no. The desert was the only place the voice sounded close enough to be real. One night, after a dust storm scraped the sky raw, the transmission shifted again. The voice carried strain now, a tremor at the edges. "Relay, confirm count," it said. I swallowed and replied, 1. The static surged, and beneath it, I heard movement, fabric brushing fabric, a cough quickly smothered, the faint clink of gear. "We have 3, the voice said, like a correction that mattered. My throat tightened. Evan's unit had deployed in 4s. I asked for names. The signal wavered, then stabilized. The first name was Evans. I don't remember falling to my knees, but I remember the cold floor, the console lights blurring. I don't remember answering after that, but when I listened to the recording later, my voice was there, steady in a way mine never felt, confirming, acknowledging, staying on the line. The final transmission came on a night when the desert was unnaturally quiet. The air so still the stars seemed pinned in place. The voice didn't give coordinates this time. It said, "We see the lights." My station lights flickered in response. A subtle dip and surge like a held breath. "Confirm dismissal," the voice said. I thought of my brother explaining how exercises ended, how someone always had to say it out loud, make it official so the body could relax. I thought of the notebook in my hands, the circled coordinate, the note that said, "No dismissal yet." My chest hurt. "You're clear," I said, and meant it with everything I had left. The static swelled, then fell away into a clean carrier tone that held for a long, quiet second before cutting off. The frequency went dead, no echo, no return. I sat there until dawn, waiting for 2:17 to come again. It didn't. In the weeks that followed, the station replaced half its equipment and told me to stop using legacy bands. I resigned without arguing. I drove out to the edge of the range one last time and parked where the map said nothing was supposed to be. The desert looked like it always had, endless and indifferent. But when the wind shifted, I smelled oil and canvas, faint and familiar. I left Evan's notebook under a cairn of stones and turned back. Some nights now, far from Tonopah, my phone will buzz at 2:17 with no notification, and I'll feel that old pressure in my ears, like a signal just out of reach. I don't answer anymore, not because I'm afraid, but because I believe that some transmissions aren't meant to be chased forever. They're meant to be acknowledged once, clearly, by someone willing to listen, and then allowed, finally, to go quiet. Some signals don't fade away, they just wait. For someone willing to listen. If you've ever heard something you weren't supposed to, you already know why these stories stay buried. This is FearFiles Whispered, and whatever you heard tonight, don't answer it.